Invisible Hands, Episode 6 Intelligence, Insight, and the Limits of Discernment. Hello, and welcome back. If you've been listening to Invisible Hands from the beginning, you'll recognize that this series has never been about villains, pathology, or fear. It has been an exploration of process, how influence works, how power shapes perception, and how harm often occurs quietly, without obvious cruelty or chaos. Each episode is built toward this one. We began by mapping manipulation not as something done by bad people, but as a set of mechanisms that reliably erode autonomy when conditions align. We explored how patterns, not personalities, leave predictable damage. From there, we looked at narcissistic dynamics, not as caricatures, but as relational strategies organized around validation, image, and control of narrative. We examined how confusion, not aggression, is often the first injury. In episode 3, we move beyond personal dynamics and into power itself, into sociopathy and psychopathy not as diagnoses, but as strategies that become highly functional inside systems. We asked why emotional detachment, clarity without conscience, and instrumental thinking are so often rewarded, and how harm becomes procedural rather than personal. In episode 4, we examined empathy not as a guarantee of safety, but as a capacity that can exist without care. We explored how attunement without accountability can feel calming while leaving people unprotected, and why being understood is not the same as being held. And in episode 5, we turned towards spiritual language and psychological injury. We explored what happens when meaning arrives before safety, when explanation stabilizes confusion instead of orienting the body, and when embodiment is replaced by identity. Not to reject spirituality, but to restore sequence, signal before meaning. If there is a single thread running through all of these episodes, it is this. Harm does not require malice. Influence does not require force. Confusion does not require stupidity. Which brings us to this episode. This episode is not about people who lack insight. It is about people who have a great deal of it. If you're listening to this, there's a good chance you identify as thoughtful, reflective, emotionally intelligent, or psychologically literate. You may value nuance over certainty. You may pride yourself on seeing multiple perspectives. You may be someone others describe as deep, aware, or wise. This episode is for you. Before we go any further, it's important to say this clearly and without qualification. This is not an episode about stupidity. It is not an episode about gullibility. It is not an episode about intellectual failure. It is an episode about how intelligence behaves under pressure. Because one of the most damaging myths in our culture is that intelligence protects. That insight confers immunity. If someone is smart enough, reflective enough, or self-aware enough, they will see harm coming and step away in time. The reality is more uncomfortable. Intelligence does not always protect. Sometimes it stabilizes what should be questioned. This episode exists to explore that paradox, without shame, without exposure, and without asking you to disown the very qualities that make you who you are. What this episode is, and what this episode is not. Let's set the boundaries gently. This episode is not about diagnosing others. It is not about identifying manipulators, predators, or dark figures hidden in plain sight. It is not about encouraging suspicion, hypervigilance, or withdrawal from relationships, work, or community. And it is not about telling you that your intelligence has failed you. This episode is about conditions, not characters. It is about understanding how intelligence, insight, and self-awareness function when the nervous system is under subtle relational pressure. How reflection can delay response. How empathy can soften boundaries. How does explanation replace orientation? These are not flaws, they are adaptations. The quiet mechanism. This episode examines throughout the earlier episodes. We've seen how harm often emerges not through overt aggression, but through ambiguity rather than clarity, warmth rather than threat, explanation rather than coercion, meaning rather than force. In each case, the nervous system adapts first and the mind follows. This episode looks at what happens next. What happens when the mind is especially good at following? When it explains discomfort instead of responding to it. When it contextualizes harm instead of confronting it. When it values coherence over contact. In other words, what happens when intelligence is asked to do the job of safety? Intelligence as a regulator, not a shield. One of the core ideas we'll return to throughout this episode is that intelligence often functions as a regulatory mechanism. When something feels off, the mind steps in to stabilize the experience. It searches for meaning. It constructs an explanation. It reassures. It reframes. This can be profoundly adaptive. But stabilization is not the same as safety. And coherence is not the same as alignment. Intelligence can make something make sense long before it is safe. That does not mean intelligence is the problem. It means it has limits. A note on self-awareness and identity. Many listeners to this series identify strongly with self-awareness, reflection, psychological or spiritual literacy. This episode does not undermine that identity. It complicates it. Self-awareness is not a permanent state. It is context-sensitive. Under relational pressure, self-awareness can quietly turn into self-monitoring. Reflection can become self-containment, and insight can become endurance. This episode is not asking you to think less. It is asking you to notice when thinking has replaced responding. The nervous system is still central. As with every episode in this series, discernment is not treated as a purely cognitive function. Discernment is embodied. The body registers shifts in tone, timing, and relational posture before the mind arrives at interpretation. When intelligence takes over too quickly, those signals are not wrong, they are simply overridden. This episode continues to return to the same sequence we've been restoring throughout the series. Signal first, meaning second. When that order collapses, even the most insightful people can lose orientation, not because they lack discernment, but because discernment has been displaced. No shame, no exposure. This episode will not ask you to catalogue mistakes or confess poor judgment. It will not ask you to retrospectively judge past relationships, workplaces, or spiritual experiences. The purpose here is not exposure. It is dignity. Human cognition did not evolve to detect subtle harm embedded in calm language, thoughtful explanation, or elevated meaning. It evolved to preserve connection and coherence under uncertainty. This episode respects that. What this episode will offer over the course of this episode, we'll explore why intelligent people often stay longer in destabilizing dynamics, how insight can delay action without resolving discomfort, why does explanation feel safer than sensation, how language recruits intelligence rather than overpowering it, why discernment collapses under the very conditions that reward insight, how self-trust can be restored without self-blame, but we will move slowly. No urgency, no instruction, no fixing. Because clarity does not arrive through force, persuasion, or coercion, it arrives through orientation. If there is one line to hold as we move forward, it is this. This episode isn't about why people lack discernment. It's about why discernment fails under the conditions it was never designed to survive. If that lands, the rest will find its place. Nothing is being demanded of you here. Nothing is being taken away. We are simply going to look carefully, respectfully, at how intelligence behaves when it is asked to compensate for instability, and why that compensation can quietly become a trap. We'll begin with the paradox at the center of this episode. Why the very qualities we rely on to understand the world can sometimes keep us inside what harms us. Section 2. The intelligence paradox. There is a quiet moment many intelligent people recognize, though they rarely name it. It's the moment when something doesn't quite sit right, not sharply, not alarmingly, just enough to register as tension, a tightening in the chest, a pause before responding, a sense that something has shifted in the room, and almost immediately something else happens. The mind steps in, it begins to explain. Not defensively, not dramatically, thoughtfully, generously. It considers context, it accounts for pressure, it looks for nuance. It reminds you that situations are complex, that people are layered, that intent matters, and that no system is perfect. And just like that, the sensation is no longer center stage. This is the paradox at the heart of this episode. Intelligent people are often less likely to leave early, not because they don't notice misalignment, but because they are so good at understanding it. They stay longer, not out of blindness, but out of coherence. Intelligence seeks to make sense of things. That is one of its great strengths. It builds models. It integrates conflicting information. It tolerates ambiguity. It resists simplistic conclusions. In healthy environments, this is stabilizing. It allows for repair. It prevents premature judgment. It supports growth. But in environments where power is asymmetrical, accountability is diffuse, or harm is subtle, that same capacity can quietly become a trap. Because intelligence does not like unresolved tension. Uncertainty feels intolerable to the analytical mind, not emotionally intolerable, but cognitively incomplete. The mind wants the story to close. It wants the variables accounted for. It wants the discomfort to have a reason. So when something feels off, intelligence doesn't ask, should I stay? It asks, what's going on here? And that question keeps people inside situations long after the body has begun to withdraw. This is particularly visible in workplace environments. Consider a team where expectations are constantly shifting, but never explicitly stated. Deadlines move, priorities change, feedback is vague but critical, support is offered verbally but not structurally. An employee notices they feel tense before meetings. They rehearse what they'll say. Their speech becomes more careful. Their energy contracts slightly. But rather than responding to that contraction, they think, it's a fast-paced environment. Leadership is under pressure. I need to be more adaptable. This is a growth opportunity. Each explanation is reasonable. None is false. And yet the body continues to tighten. The employee stays, not because they don't feel the strain, but because they can explain it. Reflective people are especially skilled at this. They are trained, formally or informally, to examine their own reactions, to question their assumptions, to look inward before looking outward. This is often framed as emotional maturity. And in many contexts it is. But when the environment itself is misaligned, reflection can become a form of self-containment. Instead of asking whether the situation is sustainable, reflective people ask whether they are interpreting it correctly. Instead of noticing how often they leave interactions depleted, they analyze why they feel that way. The question shifts from what is happening to what does this say about me? And that shift keeps people inside dynamics that are quietly eroding them. Insight can delay exit, not because insight is wrong, but because it reframes urgency into understanding. Someone may recognize that a manager is inconsistent, but contextualize it as stress. They may see that boundaries are crossed, but interpret it as a cultural difference. They may feel undervalued, but attribute it to organizational complexity rather than relational disregard. Each reframing buys time, and time in these contexts is not neutral. There is also a deeper layer to this paradox. Intelligent people often value fairness. They want to see all sides. They are wary of reactive decisions. They don't want to oversimplify. So when something feels wrong, they hesitate to trust that feeling outright. They look for corroboration. They wait for more information. They give the benefit of the doubt again and again. This is not passivity. It is an ethical stance. But ethics without embodiment can quietly become endurance. The body, meanwhile, is not waiting for certainty. It is responding to the sequence. It notices tone before content. It registers power before intention. It senses timing before explanation. When those signals are overridden repeatedly, the body does not argue. It adapts, it tightens, it braces. It reduces spontaneity. The person may still function well, even excel, but something narrows. And because the mind can explain this narrowing, it becomes normalized. Another workplace example, imagine a role where praise is frequent but inconsistent. Recognition arrives unpredictably. Expectations are high but rarely clarified. The employee feels seen one moment, invisible the next. This creates a subtle oscillation. When praise comes, the body relaxes. When it disappears, tension returns. The mind steps in to manage the fluctuation. They're busy. They trust me to self-manage. This is how leadership works. Again, nothing overtly wrong. But over time, the employee becomes hyper-attuned. They track cues. They anticipate shifts. They adjust behavior preemptively. This is intelligence at work. But it is also the nervous system in emotional labor. And because the explanations are coherent, the cost remains invisible. Uncertainty is particularly difficult for analytical minds because it resists closure. Something isn't aligned. The mind replies, let's gather more information. In stable environments, this works. In unstable ones, the information never resolves. So the mind keeps working. This is why intelligent people often leave last. Not because they don't see the pattern, but because they can articulate it so well. They can hold the contradiction. This isn't ideal, but it's understandable. They can live inside the grey zone. Until the body can't anymore, what often follows is not clarity, but exhaustion. The person may eventually leave, not with certainty, but with fatigue. Not because they know exactly why, but because staying has become too costly. And afterwards, the shame sets in. Why did I stay so long? Why didn't I see this sooner? How did I rationalize something that was harming me? This episode exists to answer that question without blame. The answer is not that intelligence failed. It's that intelligence was doing what it does best, creating coherence. But coherence is not the same as safety. And understanding is not the same as orientation. There is one line that holds this entire paradox. Intelligence doesn't protect you from influence. It often keeps you inside it longer. Not because intelligence is a weakness in ability, but because it is generous, because it tolerates complexity, because it resists certainty in a world that often demands it. The work ahead in this episode is not to abandon intelligence. It is to slow it down, to let sensation speak before interpretation takes over, to allow the body's tightening to be noticed, not explained away. Because discernment does not come from thinking less. It comes from thinking after the body has had a chance to speak. Section 3, when insight becomes a trap. There is a moment in many people's stories that only becomes recognizable and visible in hindsight. At the time, it doesn't register as danger. It doesn't even register as harm. It feels like work, internal work. The kind that intelligent, reflective people believe they are meant to do. Something feels uncomfortable. Not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to register as friction. A comment lands strangely, a pattern repeats. An interaction leaves a faint residue of tension, and the response is almost automatic. They analyze, they contextualize, they empathize. Not because they are avoiding the issue, but because this is how they have learned to respond to complexity. This section is about observing that response, not judging it, not interrupting it yet, simply noticing how insight itself can become a stabilizing mechanism that quietly replaces orientation. When intelligent people encounter discomfort, their first move is rarely withdrawal. It is engagement. They turn toward the experience rather than away from it. They ask questions. They try to understand what's happening beneath the surface. They look for nuance. This is often framed by themselves and by others as emotional maturity, and in many contexts it is. But maturity becomes something else when it is consistently used to contain discomfort rather than respond to it. One of the most consistent patterns is this: when something feels wrong, smart people assume there is something to be understood. They assume missing information. They assume complexity not yet grasped. They assume that if they can just see the full picture, the discomfort will resolve. So they analyze, they replay conversations, they examine tone, they map motivations, they look for contextual pressures. This analysis often produces plausible explanations, and plausibility is powerful. Contextualization comes next. Once an explanation is found, it is placed within a larger frame. They are under pressure. This is a demanding environment. They didn't mean it that way. This system is complicated. Everyone is struggling right now. Context softens the edge of discomfort. It does not remove it, but it makes it tolerable. And tolerable discomfort rarely triggers change. Empathy then seals the pattern. Intelligent people are often deeply empathic. They can imagine the inner world of others with ease. They understand how stress, trauma, insecurity, or responsibility shape behavior. This empathy is not performative, it is genuine. But when empathy flows in one direction, from the person experiencing harm toward the person or system causing it, something shifts. Empathy becomes containment. What gets lost in this sequence is the boundary. Not a spoken boundary, not a confrontation, but an internal one. The boundary between understanding and endurance. Over time, meaning replaces boundary. Instead of asking, is this acceptable? The question becomes, why is this happening? Instead of responding to the body's signal, the mind steps in to resolve it. This resolution feels responsible. It feels thoughtful. It feels kind. But it also delays orientation. Understanding becomes a substitute for safety. Not because understanding is wrong, but because it is asked to do too much. Understanding explains experience. Safety regulates it. When understanding arrives first, the body adapts to remain inside the explanation. This pattern shows up clearly in relationships. Consider a relationship where recurring misattunement occurs, not through cruelty, but through inconsistency. Promises are made and quietly adjusted. Repair conversations are frequent, articulate, and even insightful. Language is reflective. Intentions are named. Growth is discussed. On the surface, this looks healthy, but the pattern underneath is revealing. The relationship is repaired theoretically, not structurally. The same issues reappear. The same discomfort returns. The same conversations repeat. The intelligent partner stays engaged because the dialogue is good. They understand the dynamics. They can articulate them clearly. They can empathize with the other person's limitations. And because the explanations are coherent, they stay. The body, meanwhile, begins to brace. The person may notice subtle changes. They prepare emotionally before interactions. They speak more carefully. They lower expectations. They adapt. But because the relationship is understood, these adaptations feel voluntary rather than imposed. Insight replaces protection. In workplaces, the pattern often looks even cleaner. Intelligent employees are often rewarded for tolerance. They can hold pressure. They can manage ambiguity. They can absorb change without complaint. When workloads increase or boundaries blur, they don't react immediately. They contextualize. It's a transitional phase. Leadership is under strain. This is part of growth. They empathize upward. They understand the constraints. They appreciate the complexity of decision-making. They don't want to be seen as rigid or reactive. So they stay. Over time, intelligence becomes the mechanism that allows harm to continue without challenge. Not because the employee is unaware, but because they are too aware. They see the system clearly enough to tolerate it, until the cost accumulates. In spiritual or therapeutic spaces, the pattern can be even harder to name. These are environments that explicitly value insight, reflection, and self-examination. Discomfort is often framed as meaningful. Resistance is explored rather than acted upon. Boundaries are examined rather than asserted. This can be profoundly growth-oriented, but it can also create a trap. When discomfort arises, the immediate response is interpretation. What is this teaching me? What part of me is being activated? Where is this coming from? These are not harmful questions. But when they are asked, instead of responding to the discomfort, something shifts. The person turns inward while the external dynamic remains unchanged. Reflection replaces protection. In these contexts, insight becomes a form of compliance, not because anyone demands it, but because the culture rewards it. Those who reflect deeply are seen as evolved. Those who raise concerns may be seen as resistant or unready. So intelligent people do what they do best. They reflect. Across all these contexts, the pattern is the same. Discomfort arises, insight engages, meaning is constructed, adaptation follows. And because adaptation is thoughtful, it does not feel like harm. This is why so many people struggle to name what happened to them. There was no obvious cruelty, no clear violation, no dramatic rupture. There was just a slow narrowing. a gradual loss of ease, a quiet sense of self-betrayal, an exhaustion that didn't make sense. The key principle here is simple, but easily overlooked. Understanding is not the same as orientation. Understanding explains what is happening. Orientation tells you where you are. When understanding replaces orientation, people can explain a situation beautifully while remaining dislocated within it. They know why something is happening, but not whether they should stay. Orientation is embodied. It comes from noticing. How often does your body tighten? How much energy does adaptation require? Whether repair leads to change or just explanation. Whether empathy flows in one direction. Whether insight results in protection or endurance. These are not moral judgments. They are signals. This section is not asking you to stop analyzing, contextualizing, or empathizing. Those are capacities we must continue to preserve. It is asking you to notice when those capacities are being used to contain discomfort rather than respond to it. When insight becomes a trap, it is not because insight is false. It is because it has been recruited to stabilize what needs to be oriented. In the next section, we will return more explicitly to the body. We will look at how cognition and neuroception interact, and why the body often knows something is wrong long before the mind agrees. Section 4, the body knows. Cognition versus neuroception. There is a reason this series keeps returning to the body. Not as a metaphor, not as poetry, but as physiology. Because long before intelligence interprets, explains, or contextualizes, the nervous system is already doing its work. It is scanning, orienting, and registering viability. It is answering a question that is older than language and far more decisive than thought. Is this safe enough to stay engaged? This section is about restoring that layer, not to replace intelligence, but to put it back into a relationship with something it has quietly overshadowed. The body detects threat before thought because it has to. Cognition is slow, reflection is slower, insight is slower still. Neuroception, the nervous system's capacity to sense safety and threat beneath conscious awareness, operates continuously and automatically. It does not wait for evidence. It does not require intention. It responds to microsignals, tone, pacing, proximity, facial tension, relational posture, power asymmetry, unpredictability. These signals are often too subtle for conscious thought to name, but they are decisive for the body. This is not intuition in the mystical sense. It is pattern recognition at the level of survival. In healthy environments, cognition and neuroception work together. The body signals, the mind checks, meaning integrates. But under subtle relational pressure, this sequence collapses. The mind does not wait for the body. It leads, and when the mind leads too quickly, the body is not wrong, it is ignored. One of the most important misunderstandings about bodily signals is the assumption that they represent confusion. People say, I felt confused, as if confusion were an error state, a lack of clarity, a cognitive failure, something to be resolved through better thinking. But confusion is not ignorance. Confusion is a state shift. It is what happens when the nervous system detects misalignment that the mind has not yet integrated. The body knows something has changed. The mind does not yet know what. That gap is confusion. In intelligent people, that gap is often intolerable. Not emotionally intolerable, cognitively intolerable. The mind wants coherence. It wants continuity. It wants an explanation. So it fills the gap. This is where intelligence slows response. When something feels off, the mind stays online. It keeps analyzing, reflecting, contextualizing. It searches for explanation rather than orientation. The body, meanwhile, is asking a different question. Not why is this happening, but what do I need to do to stay safe? When the mind answers first, the body adapts. It tightens, it freezes, it fawns. But because these adaptations are quiet and functional, they are mistaken for insight. Freeze and fawn often masquerade as intelligence. Freeze looks like contemplation. Fawn looks like empathy. Neither are they conscious choices. They are survival strategies. Freeze occurs when the nervous system detects a threat but does not see a clear path to action. In relational contexts, freeze does not look like immobility. It looks like overthinking. The person becomes still externally, but busy internally. They pause. They wait. They gather information. They hold back their response. This is not passivity. It is a holding pattern. And because intelligent people are good at thinking, freeze often feels productive. I just need to understand this better. I'll respond once I have clarity. There's more to see here. The body has already decided something is off. The mind is buying time. Fawn is similar, but relational. It emerges when connection feels threatened and the nervous system prioritizes maintaining it. In the fawn state, the body leans toward appeasement. The person becomes accommodating. They soften language. They empathize more. They adapt. Again, this does not feel like a loss of agency. It feels like maturity. I don't want to escalate. I can see where they're coming from. It's not worth making a big deal out of this. But the adaptation is not coming from discernment. It is coming from neuroception. Both freeze and fawn are responses to subtle threat, not overt danger. They emerge in environments that appear safe on the surface, but contain unpredictability, asymmetry, or misattunement underneath. And because there is no obvious threat, cognition remains active. The mind does not disengage, it works harder. This is where the paradox deepens. The more intelligent a person is, the more easily freeze and fawn are rationalized. Freeze becomes depth, fawn becomes compassion. The body's adaptations are translated into virtues, and because they are virtuous, they are not questioned. Consider a workplace meeting where power dynamics are unclear. A leader uses warm language but avoids specificity. Expectations are implied rather than stated. Accountability is diffuse. An employee notices their body tighten when certain topics arise. They speak less. They choose words carefully. They hesitate to ask questions. Freeze is present, but the mind explains it as professionalism. I need to be thoughtful here. This is a complex issue. I don't want to oversimplify. The body is responding to unpredictability. The mind is stabilizing it, or consider a therapeutic or spiritual space where authority is subtle. A guide speaks calmly, insightfully. Language is enticing. Meaning is offered generously. A participant feels a contraction when something is said, not fear, just a quiet pull back. But instead of responding to that signal, they interpret it. This is resistance. This is my ego. This is something I need to work through. Fawn emerges as openness. The body adapts to maintain connection. In both cases, the body was not confused. It was precise. What looks like confusion is actually a delay between signal and permission. The signal arrived, permission to act did not. So the mind intervened. Neuroception does not require belief. It does not care about narrative, intention, or meaning. It cares about pattern, inconsistent warmth, shifting rules, unpredictable responses, unspoken power. These are all registered before the mind can articulate them. And when cognition overrides those signals repeatedly, the body does not escalate. It endures. This endurance is costly. Not immediately, not dramatically, but cumulatively. People begin to feel tired without knowing why. They lose spontaneity. They second-guess themselves. They feel off but can't name it, because the mind has been managing what the body was meant to orient to. This is why the reframe matters. The body wasn't confused. Your mind was buying time to understand, buying time to contextualize, buying time to preserve coherence. But coherence is not orientation, and orientation cannot be rushed. The purpose of restoring physiology as the missing variable is not to elevate the body above the mind. It is to return them to a relationship. The body signals, the mind listens. Action integrates both. When that sequence is honored, intelligence becomes discernment rather than delay. This section is not asking you to trust every sensation blindly. It is asking you to stop treating sensation as something that needs to be justified before it can matter. The body does not speak in arguments. It speaks in shifts, and those shifts deserve time. When people begin to listen to neuroception again, something subtle changes. They stop explaining themselves out of alignment. They allow discomfort to exist without immediate resolution. They give their body permission to finish its sentence before the mind replies. This does not make them reactive, it makes them present. In the next section, we will look at how language interacts with this process, how words can recruit intelligence to override neuroception, and why smart people are particularly vulnerable to linguistic influence. Section 5: Intelligence as a regulatory target. There is a widespread assumption that intelligence makes people harder to influence, that if someone is articulate, reflective, emotionally literate, or cognitively agile, they will naturally be more resistant to persuasion, manipulation, or subtle control. What this assumption misses is something essential. Language does not overpower intelligence. It recruits it. This section is about how that recruitment works, not through deception, coercion, or obvious pressure, but through alignment, through language that feels respectful, sophisticated, and affirming. Language that does not challenge intelligence, but flatters it. Language that turns understanding into participation. For many smart people, influence does not arrive as a threat. It arrives as recognition. Intelligent people tend to value nuance. They resist simplistic explanations. They distrust certainty that arrives too quickly. They prefer layered accounts, contextual awareness, and complexity over reduction. This is a strength, but it also creates a predictable opening. Language that presents itself as nuanced, complex, and thoughtful does not trigger defense. It signals safety. It signals belonging. It signals that the speaker operates at the same cognitive altitude. When someone says, "You understand this," the message is not just informational. It is relational. It says, "We are alike," and likeness lowers guard. One of the most effective ways language steers intelligent people is by affirming their identity as discerning. Phrases like, "You see the complexity here. You're not reactive like others. You can hold more than one truth." These statements do not demand agreement. They invite alignment. They position the listener as already inside the frame. Disagreeing then becomes awkward. not because disagreement is forbidden, but because it would contradict the identity just affirmed. To question feels like self-betrayal. This is how complexity becomes compliance, not through force, but through self-concept. When a person sees themselves as thoughtful, fair-minded, and capable of holding ambiguity, they are more likely to tolerate discomfort in the name of coherence. They stay engaged longer, they suspend judgment longer, they delay their response longer, not because they are convinced, but because they are trying to be consistent with who they believe they are. Language that flatters intelligence often avoids directive statements. It does not say, you must. It says, you'll understand why. It does not say, this is how it is. It says, it's more complicated than that. It does not say, you're wrong. It says, that's one way of seeing it. Each of these phrases appears open, but openness without boundaries can become directionless. Ambiguity plays a crucial role here. For intelligent people, ambiguity feels respectful. It leaves room for thought. It avoids dogma. But ambiguity also disables boundary formation. When expectations are unclear, when language remains abstract, when meaning floats without anchoring, it becomes difficult to locate a point of refusal. What exactly are you disagreeing with? What exactly would you say no to? So the mind stays engaged, waiting for clarity that never quite arrives. Consider how this operates in workplace environments. A leader says, this is a complex situation. There are a lot of moving parts. We need people who can see the bigger picture. These statements are not false, but they often precede requests that are vague, unbounded, or asymmetrical. Workloads expand without explicit agreement. Responsibilities blur without renegotiation. Boundaries erode without confrontation. The intelligent employee does not object immediately. They understand complexity. They want to be reasonable. They don't want to be simplistic, so they adapt. The same pattern appears in relational contexts. Someone says, you're someone who gets this. You can see how layered this is. You're not like other people who overreact. The listener feels seen, and because they feel seen, they stay present, even as their body tightens. They explain away discomfort as nuance. They tolerate inconsistency as depth. They accept ambiguity as sophistication. In spiritual or therapeutic spaces, this recruitment of intelligence is often even more refined. Language emphasizes insight, awareness, and capacity. You're very conscious. You're doing the work. You're able to hold paradox. Again, none of this is inherently manipulative. But when such language appears alongside power asymmetry, teacher and seeker, guide and participant, it becomes regulatory. It shapes behavior. One of the most subtle aspects of linguistic influence is how it redirects agency. Questions are particularly effective. Instead of stating, this is how it is, language asks, what do you think this is showing you? Where do you feel resistance? What might this be inviting you to explore? These questions sound empowering, but they also relocate responsibility. The focus shifts inward, regardless of whether the issue is internal. The person begins to search themselves rather than assess the environment. This is where language interacts with the nervous system. When ambiguity is paired with affirmation, the body relaxes just enough to stay engaged. When clarity is withheld, the mind keeps working. This combination, warmth plus uncertainty, is stabilizing without being resolved. It keeps people inside the interaction. Another key factor is how language handles disagreement. In environments that recruit intelligence, disagreement is rarely shut down directly. Instead, it is reframed. You're not wrong, but that's valid, and also, I hear that, and we need to consider. These phrases acknowledge without responding. They validate feelings without changing structure. For intelligent people, this feels respectful, but respect without consequence can be disorienting. Over time, language becomes a way of regulating response, not by telling people what to think, but by shaping how long they stay thinking. As long as the conversation remains complex, unresolved, and reflective, the body does not receive a clear signal to act. And because intelligent people value thoughtfulness, they stay. This is not persuasion in the classical sense. No one is being convinced of something untrue. Instead, cognition is being occupied. The mind is engaged just enough to override the body's signal. It is important to say this clearly. This does not require bad intent. Many people use this kind of language sincerely. They value nuance. They avoid certainty. They believe complexity is ethical. The effect, however, does not depend on intent. When language recruits intelligence without providing structure, accountability, or clarity, it regulates behavior. This is why smart people are often easier to steer linguistically, not because they are naive, but because they are responsive to how something is said. They are attuned to tone, framing, and implication. They listen deeply, and deep listening without anchoring can become self-suspension. Over time, people begin to feel something subtle. They are always thinking, but rarely deciding. They understand, but do not feel settled. They feel included, but not protected. Their intelligence is active, but their orientation is fading. This is where the anchor line matters. Language doesn't overpower intelligence, it recruits it. It recruits it to stabilize ambiguity, to tolerate uncertainty, to maintain a connection. But intelligence was never meant to do this alone. It was meant to work with the body. When language is allowed to recruit intelligence without embodiment, it can keep people inside misaligned situations indefinitely. Not through force, through fluency. Restoring discernment here does not mean rejecting complexity or nuance. It means noticing when complexity is being used to avoid clarity, when ambiguity replaces agreement, when affirmation replaces care, when insight replaces action. In the next section, we will move into the shadow spectrum, not to label people, but to understand how capacity without accountability creates predictable harm. We will look at how insight, empathy, and intelligence can exist without care, and why that matters. Section 6, Shadow Spectrum, Capacity Without Constraint. This section is not about exposing bad actors. It is not about naming villains, diagnosing personalities, or assigning intent. It is not about moral judgment, blame, or casting suspicion on intelligence, insight, or awareness themselves. It is about capacity, and what happens when capacity is not paired with constraint. One of the quiet confusions in modern psychological and spiritual discourse is the assumption that awareness equals care. If someone understands emotions, dynamics, or inner worlds, they will naturally act in ways that protect others. That insight inherently contains ethics. That emotional intelligence by itself is a safeguard against harm. It isn't. Intelligence is neutral. Insight is neutral. Awareness is neutral. They are capacities, not commitments. This is not a pessimistic view of human nature. It is a precise one. Capacities describe what someone can do, not what they will do. They describe range, not orientation. When we forget this, we mistake sophistication for safety. The shadow spectrum does not refer to a group of people. It refers to a relational pattern that emerges when capacity operates without constraint. Constraint does not mean restriction. It means accountability. It means responsibility for impact. It means limits that shape behavior, not just understanding. When constraint is absent, capacity becomes leverage. Cognitive empathy is a useful place to begin. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand another person's emotional state, to recognize, predict, and respond accurately to feelings. It is a powerful skill. It allows for attunement, communication, and coordination. But cognitive empathy does not require care. It requires perception. Someone can understand how you feel without being affected by it. They can track your reactions without being moved to protect you. They can anticipate your needs without intending to meet them. This does not make them malicious. It makes them effective. When cognitive empathy is unpaired from responsibility, it becomes a tool. It allows someone to predict how others will respond, regulate emotional tone strategically, present warmth when needed, withdraw without appearing overtly harmful. The body of the other person may feel soothed. The relationship may feel attuned, but nothing structural changes. Understanding flows in one direction. Responsibility does not. This is why emotionally intelligent people can still cause harm. Not because they lack awareness, but because awareness alone does not constrain behavior. Insight tells you what is happening. Care determines what you do about it. When insight is not anchored to care, it does not heal. It stabilizes power. Consider how this plays out in everyday relational contexts. In a relationship, one partner may be highly emotionally literate. They can name dynamics, reflect feelings accurately, and speak insightfully about attachment patterns. Conversations are articulate. Self-awareness is evident. But when the same issues arise repeatedly, when boundaries are crossed, commitments shift, or repair does not lead to change, insight becomes performative. Not because it is fake, but it does not result in protection. The partner experiencing harm may feel conflicted. They feel seen, they feel understood, they feel intellectually met, and yet they also feel unsafe. This creates a paradox that is difficult to name. How can someone who understands me so well continue to hurt me? The answer is not that the understanding is false. It is that it is unconstrained. In workplaces, this pattern often hides behind professionalism. A manager may be emotionally astute. They know how to motivate, reassure, and contextualize pressure. They speak the language of well-being, growth, and resilience. Employees feel acknowledged. Concerns are listened to. Stress is validated. But workloads remain unchanged. Boundaries remain blurred. Structural issues remain intact. Insight flows. Care does not. The harm is not emotional cruelty. It is endurance without relief. In spiritual or therapeutic spaces, the pattern can become even more subtle. Guides, teachers, or facilitators may possess deep psychological or emotional insight. They can read group dynamics, sense vulnerability, and respond with attuned language. Participants feel deeply seen. Their inner worlds are mirrored accurately. Their experiences are framed meaningfully. But when power asymmetry exists and accountability is diffuse, insight can become a mechanism of control, not overtly, not intentionally, but functionally. This is where the idea of the dark empath often appears, and just as often becomes mythologized. The term is frequently used online to describe someone who combines empathy with manipulation, as if this were a distinct personality type or hybrid creature. That framing is misleading. There is nothing mystical about this pattern. What is often being described is simply cognitive empathy operating without ethical constraint. Empathy does not guarantee benevolence. Sensitivity does not guarantee safety. These capacities describe perception, not orientation. When insight is used for prediction rather than protection, the relationship changes shape. The person with insight knows when to lean in, when to pull back, when to soothe, and when to destabilize slightly. This knowledge does not have to be weaponized consciously to be harmful. The effect emerges from asymmetry. One person adapts, the other remains unchanged. This is why harm in these dynamics often feels clean. There is no obvious cruelty, no raised voices, no dramatic rupture. There is just a quiet sense that something is wrong and no clear place to put it, because insight has already accounted for the feeling. The shadow spectrum is not about condemning intelligence or emotional skill. It is about recognizing that capacity without constraint is unstable. Just as physical strength without restraint can cause injury, emotional or cognitive capacity without responsibility can cause relational harm. The harm is not loud, it is cumulative. One of the most destabilizing aspects of this pattern is how it undermines self-trust. People begin to doubt their signals because they conflict with the insight being offered. They understand me, so why do I feel unsafe? They're so aware, so why doesn't anything change? This doubt does not come from confusion alone. It comes from a mismatch between being seen and being held, between understanding and care. Care has qualities that insight alone does not. Care is consistent. Care constrains behavior. Care changes structure, not just language. Care takes responsibility for impact. Insight can name harm. Care prevents its repetition. This is why the key line matters. Insight without accountability doesn't heal, it stabilizes power. Power here does not mean domination. It means the ability to shape outcomes without being shaped in return. When insight flows one way and adaptation flows the other, power consolidates quietly. This section is not asking you to mistrust insight, empathy, or awareness. It is asking you to notice whether they are paired with a constraint, whether understanding leads to protection, whether reflection leads to change, whether attunement leads to responsibility. If it does, capacity supports connection. If it does not, capacity becomes leverage. None of this requires judgment. It requires clarity. And clarity begins with separating what someone can perceive from what they are willing to be accountable for. That distinction restores orientation. In the next section, we will ground this understanding with a small number of psychological concepts, not to explain experience away, but to support it without overwhelming it. Section 7, Psychological Insight. Why rationalization works. This section is not here to introduce new explanations. It is here to name, carefully, why the explanations you already had worked, even when they quietly cost you something. Rationalization is often spoken about as denial, avoidance, or self-deception. In reality, it is none of those things. Rationalization is a stabilizing function. It helps the mind maintain coherence when the nervous system is under pressure and action feels risky, premature, or socially costly. For intelligent people, rationalization is not a failure of thinking. It is thinking of doing exactly what was designed to do, preserve continuity, cognitive dissonance. When knowing and feeling diverge, cognitive dissonance is usually described as discomfort that arises when beliefs and actions don't align. But in the context we've been exploring, the dissonance is subtler. It is not between belief and action. It is between bodily signal and cognitive meaning. The body registers contraction, fatigue, or withdrawal. The mind holds an explanation that makes sense. Both feel true. This creates tension, not because one is false, but because they point in different directions. Rationalization resolves this tension by privileging meaning. It tells the body, this discomfort has a reason. It tells the self, staying makes sense. And because the explanation is coherent, the dissonance softens. Not because alignment has been restored, but because contradiction has been managed. Trauma bonding through coherence trauma bonding is often misunderstood as something driven by chaos, volatility, or emotional extremes. But for intelligent people, trauma bonding often occurs through coherence. The bond forms not because the situation is confusing, but because it makes sense. Meaning explains pain. Narrative stabilizes uncertainty. Insight provides continuity. When discomfort arises, explanation arrives quickly enough to keep the system regulated. The bond is maintained through understanding rather than safety. This is why leaving feels harder than staying. Not because the environment is unpredictable, but because it is internally consistent. Breaking away would mean breaking coherence. Identity preservation in intelligent people. One of the least acknowledged drivers of rationalization is identity. Intelligent people often see themselves as discerning, fair-minded, and reflective. They value nuance. They resist simplistic conclusions. They pride themselves on being able to see what others miss. When a situation begins to feel harmful, acknowledging that harm can threaten this self-concept. If this was damaging, why did I stay? If I were being influenced, what does that say about my judgment? Rationalization protects identity. It reframes endurance as maturity. It reframes tolerance as depth. It reframes adaptation as wisdom. This is not ego defense in a shallow sense. It is self-coherence preservation. Belonging as a cognitive anchor. Belonging is not just emotional. It is cognitive. Shared meaning provides orientation. It tells us who we are, where we stand, and how to interpret experience. When belonging is at stake, in relationships, workplaces, or spiritual communities, rationalization becomes a way to remain anchored. Understanding keeps the door open. Questioning threatens exclusion. So the mind leans toward coherence. Not because it fears rejection consciously, but because the nervous system equates belonging with safety. Meaning becomes the glue, the bodily cost of overprocessing. One of the clearest signs that rationalization is at work is fatigue. Not ordinary tiredness, but a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from continuous cognitive effort. People report feeling drained after interactions that require thinking through, losing spontaneity, needing recovery time after reflection-heavy environments. This fatigue is not emotional weakness. It is the body carrying a load the mind has taken on prematurely. Relational endurance framed as maturity. In many cultures and contexts, endurance is admired. Staying calm, holding space, not reacting. These qualities are often praised as signs of growth. But endurance becomes harmful when it replaces response. When someone stays not because they are grounded, but because they are explaining themselves out of leaving. Rationalization reframes this endurance as virtue. The cost is felt later when energy is gone and orientation is lost. Perceptual narrowing disguised as depth. Another quiet effect of rationalization is narrowing. The range of acceptable interpretations shrinks. Alternative perspectives feel disruptive. Dissent feels unsophisticated. The person believes they are seeing more deeply when in fact they are seeing more narrowly. Depth becomes focus, focus becomes fixation, and because the narrative is rich, the narrowing is invisible. Why this is not a personal failure? It matters to say this plainly. Rationalization works because it helps. It stabilizes identity, it preserves belonging, it reduces dissonance, it regulates the nervous system. It is not stupidity, it is an adaptation. The problem is not that rationalization exists. The problem is when it becomes the only way discomfort is handled. What changes when this is seen? When people understand why rationalization worked, something softens. The shame eases, the self-attack quiets, the urgency to fix the past dissolves. They stop asking, why didn't I see? And begin asking, what did this allow me to survive? That question restores dignity. And dignity is the foundation of discernment. This section does not ask you to stop thinking. It asks you to notice when thinking has replaced orientation. In the next section, we will step away from explanation and return to observation. Not of others, but of the moment when intelligence overrides signal. Section 8, Observation Practice. When intelligence overrides signal. This practice is not here to correct you. It is not designed to make you more vigilant, more skeptical, or more defended. It is not asking you to become less thoughtful or to distrust your capacity to understand. And it is certainly not asking you to abandon intelligence. It is asking you to slow it down. Throughout this episode, we've explored how intelligence, insight, and reflection can quietly override bodily signals, not because something is wrong with those capacities, but because they are doing the job they were trained to do, creating coherence, preserving identity, maintaining continuity. This practice gently interrupts that sequence, not to stop thinking, but to notice when thinking arrives. Over the next few days, the invitation is simple and deliberately narrow. Notice moments where explanation arrives faster than sensation. That's it. You're not looking for danger. You're not scanning for manipulation. You're not evaluating whether a situation is healthy or unhealthy. You are noticing timing. In practice, this might look like becoming aware of how quickly your mind begins to work when something feels slightly uncomfortable. A comment lands, and before you've registered how it feels in your body, your mind is already offering context. They didn't mean it that way. It's complicated. I can see both sides. This makes sense given the circumstances. These explanations are not wrong, but notice how quickly they appear. Notice whether they arrive before you've had a chance to feel anything at all. You might also notice moments when insight quiets discomfort. A tightening in your chest eases once you've explained the situation to yourself. A vague sense of misalignment softens when you find the right interpretation. Understanding brings relief. That relief is real. And it's important to notice that it came from explanation, not from change. This practice is not about denying yourself that relief. It's about recognizing where it comes from. Another moment to notice is when understanding delays response. You sense that something is off, but instead of responding, speaking up, stepping back, or even just internally orienting, you stay engaged because you are still working it through. You may tell yourself you need more clarity. You may believe it would be premature to act. You may feel it would be unfair or simplistic to respond yet. Again, none of this is wrong. The practice is simply to notice the pattern. This observation is inward facing. It is not about monitoring others. You are not analyzing people's motives, diagnosing behaviors, or categorizing dynamics. You are not building a case. You are noticing your own sequence. Signal, interpretation, response, or delay. There are 3 explicit rules here, and they matter. No diagnosing. This practice is not about deciding who is safe, unsafe, manipulative, or harmful. Those judgments come later, if at all. Right now, the only focus is on your internal process. No fixing. You are not required to change how you respond. You are not asked to set boundaries, confront situations, or adjust behavior. Observation alone is sufficient, no self-judgment. If you notice that explanation arrives quickly, that insight soothes discomfort, or that understanding delays response, that is not a failure. It is information. Judgment collapses observation into correction. This practice stays upstream of that. You may notice that when you pause, even briefly, before interpreting, something subtle happens. The body has more room. Sensation becomes clearer. Tension is easier to locate. The difference between relief and safety becomes more distinct. This does not mean you suddenly know what to do. It means you are more present with where you are. You may also notice how strong the pull toward explanation can be. For intelligent people, understanding feels like competence. It feels ethical. It feels like the right response to complexity. This practice is not asking you to resist that pull. It is asking you to see it. Because once you can see it, you are no longer inside it unconsciously. Another important aspect of this practice is allowing ambiguity to exist longer than usual. When explanation is delayed, uncertainty can feel uncomfortable. The mind wants to resolve it. That discomfort is not a signal that something is wrong. It is a signal that orientation is still forming. Letting ambiguity exist is not the same as being passive. It is an active choice to allow the body to finish its sentence. You may find that some situations resolve themselves simply through observation. Others may not. Again, resolution is not the goal here. The goal is to restore contact between sensation and cognition, to allow intelligence to work with the body, not instead of it. It's worth emphasizing what this practice does not do. It does not turn you into someone who reacts impulsively. It does not undermine nuance. It does not flatten complexity. In fact, it preserves intelligence by giving it better data. When intelligence follows the signal rather than overriding it, discernment improves. A helpful way to hold this practice is with the frame. You're not abandoning intelligence, you're slowing it down. Slowing it enough for sensation to register. Slowing it enough for orientation to form. Slowing it enough for response to be grounded rather than justified. As you practice this, you may notice that a different kind of question begins to surface. Not a question about others, not a question about correctness, a question about yourself, about how often your ability to understand has shaped your responses and what that has cost you. That question does not belong to observation. It belongs to reflection. Section 9, Self-Reflection Prompt. This is not a task. There is nothing to complete, no insight to arrive at, no conclusion to reach. This moment is not asking you to analyze yourself, correct your past, or decide what you should have done differently. It is an invitation to pause briefly and let something surface without being managed. Throughout this episode, we've explored how intelligence, insight, and understanding can quietly keep people inside situations longer than their bodies can tolerate. Not because they are naive, not because they lack discernment, but because understanding can feel safer than responding. This reflection is meant to touch that edge gently, not to interrogate it, not to resolve it, just to notice it. There is one question, only one. You don't need to answer it out loud. You don't need to journal. You don't need to revisit memories in detail. You don't need to reach clarity. You're simply invited to let the question exist in you, the way a sensation exists before it becomes language. Where has my ability to understand kept me from responding? That's it. You may notice the mind wants to move quickly here. It may offer examples. It may defend itself. It may say, that's not what happened, or I was being reasonable. Let those responses pass. They are familiar. They are the same capacities we've been speaking about. This prompt isn't asking you to override them. It's asking you to notice what comes before them. You might feel a tightening, or a pause, or a soft recognition without detail. You might feel nothing at all. All of that is acceptable. This is not about forcing insight. It's about allowing contact. If something does surface, a relationship, a role, a moment, resist the urge to interpret it fully. You're not being asked to decide whether it was right or wrong, healthy or unhealthy. Just notice the pattern, where understanding extended endurance, where the explanation delayed response. where insight made staying feel justified. This is not a judgment of you, it's an acknowledgement of how adaptation works. Many people discover, when sitting with this question, that they were not ignoring themselves, they were protecting coherence. They were trying to be fair, to be mature, to be kind. Seeing that does not diminish you, it restores dignity. You may find that this question lingers. You don't need to push it away, you don't need to chase it either. Let it accompany you lightly. Sometimes reflection does its work without answers. Sometimes awareness comes later, quietly, without effort. This is not about undoing the past. It's about making room for response in the future. Not by thinking harder, but by allowing signal and intelligence to meet, rather than compete. Section 10, Rebuilding Orientation Without Losing Yourself. This final movement of the episode is not designed to conclude an argument. It is not here to convince you of anything, to summarize theory, or to offer a solution that neatly resolves what we've explored. It is here to settle the material, to return it to the body, to lived experience, and to something you can carry forward without effort or urgency. Because the most important thing to understand about this episode is not what it teaches, it's what it releases. Throughout this arc, we've spoken about intelligence, insight, reflection, and understanding, not as flaws, but as strengths that can quietly become overextended in the wrong conditions. And it's important to say this clearly, without qualification. You are not wrong for being thoughtful. You are not naive for being reflective. You are not weak for trying to understand. Nothing here asks you to become harder, more suspicious, or less open. What this episode has aimed for is slowly, deliberately restoring orientation. Understanding what was never a failure. Many people come to this material carrying a quiet self-accusation, a sense that they should have known sooner, that they overthought, that they tolerated too much, that they stayed when they should have left. But this framing misunderstands what actually happened. You did not stay because you lacked discernment. You stayed because discernment was operating without signal. Your intelligence was working overtime to preserve coherence, to maintain meaning, identity, and belonging, while your body was asking for space, pause, or protection. That is not failure. That is adaptation. And adaptation is not something to be ashamed of. This is not about rejecting intelligence. One of the quiet fears people have when encountering this work is that it's asking them to abandon thinking, to trust sensation blindly, to become reactive, or to dismiss nuance. It isn't. What we've been restoring is sequence. Signal first, interpretation second, response third. When this sequence is reversed, interpretation arrives before signal intelligence disappears. It becomes ungrounded. And ungrounded intelligence is exhausting. Reorientation does not mean thinking less. It means thinking later. Later enough that the sensation has time to register. Later enough that the nervous system has time to speak. Later enough that the response is not built on justification. This doesn't make you less discerning. It makes discernment possible again. It matters to say this plainly. If you recognized yourself in this episode, if you felt the weight of staying, explaining, enduring, or rationalizing, that does not mean something is wrong with you. It means your system prioritized continuity over rupture. It means your intelligence worked to preserve identity and belonging. It means you were oriented toward coherence. None of those are defects. They are human. The injury, when it occurs, is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not explosive. It is quiet. It shows up as fatigue, as narrowing, as self-doubt, as the gradual loss of spontaneity. And because there was no obvious cruelty, no single event, it becomes difficult to name. That difficulty is not confusion. It is a clue. Why repair does not mean withdrawal. Another concern that often surfaces here is the fear that awareness leads to isolation. Once you see these dynamics, you have to leave everything. That discernment means disengagement. That safety requires distance. That is not what this work is pointing toward. Rebuilding orientation does not require withdrawing from the world. It requires staying with yourself inside it. You do not need to cut people off to restore the signal. You do not need to become hypervigilant. You do not need to constantly monitor dynamics. You only need to notice when explanation replaces sensation and gently bring attention back. That is enough. The difference between insight and care, one of the most important distinctions we've made across this episode and across the series, is between understanding and care. Understanding sees, care responds. Understanding can articulate harm. Care constrains behavior, so harm does not repeat. When people feel confused in intelligent, reflective, or psychologically fluent environments, it is often because understanding is abundant, but care is absent. This absence does not always look unkind. It looks reasonable, and that is why it's so difficult to challenge. Restoring orientation means learning to ask a different kind of question. Not, do they understand me? But what changes because they understand me? If nothing changes, if responsibility is not carried, if structure does not shift, if protection does not follow, then insight is operating without constraint. That does not make it evil, but it does make it unsafe to endure indefinitely. letting intelligence come back online. As this episode comes to rest, the invitation is not to do anything with what you've heard. No decisions are required, no actions are demanded, no conclusions are necessary. What matters is that something has been resequenced. That intelligence is no longer carrying the full burden of orientation. That sensation has been allowed back into the conversation. That response can form without justification. This is not a skill to master, it is a capacity you already have. If there is one reframe to carry forward, it is this: you were not trapped because you didn't understand. You stayed because you did. And now, understanding can be placed where it belongs, after the signal, not instead of it. That shift does not make you less thoughtful. It makes you more whole. This series has never been about seeing danger everywhere. It has been about recognizing the moments when everything makes sense and you quietly disappear. Rebuilding perception does not require suspicion. It requires contact. Contact with the body. Contact with timing. Contact with what arrives before explanation. That is where discernment lives. In the next episode, we'll move into what happens after subtle influence, not in the moment, but over time. Episode 7, Rebuilding Perception After Control, explores how trust in one perception erodes under quiet, reasonable, relational pressure, and how that trust can be restored without paranoia, withdrawal, or self-doubt. We'll look at how orientation is rebuilt gently, how confidence returns without hardening, and how clarity can emerge without rewriting your past as failure, not through vigilance, but through reconnection. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, you've been listening to Invisible Hands, Manipulation, Power, and the Fracturing of Perception. I'm James Miller.